episode of VCTV, where we discuss insights, upcoming trends in the venture world, as well as connect founders with investors. Right to your TV, or for 99% of us, our mobile phones and computer screens. But my name is Ken Makashima, and I'll be a host today for today's episode. So as you can see by this iconic orange box behind me, today's discussion will be about luxury, or sorry, not just luxury, but fashion, shopping, and beauty in the venture space and how it was affected during the pandemic. So contrary to popular belief, VCs don't always just invest in tech, but have been active in the fashion space as well. Away Luggages, Allbirds, Everlane, and Glossier are some pretty well-known brands that have had venture backing. As well as more recently, brands like Martha Stance, which was founded by a Burberry alumni. So the industry overall, very impacted by the COVID pandemic, especially with disrupted supply chains, but largely has adopted. We saw early on LV and other manufacturers, pivot to manufacture PPE to combat the pandemic, while other startups have used this time to raise more venture capital to, last through this period and evolve. But before we get started, would love to say thank you to our audience for always tuning in. If you have any questions during the episode, please leave a comment below and we'll try to ask it to our panelists on today's episode. If you're a founder or investor who wants to be a part of VCTV, feel free to reach out to the LATOKEN team. And again, as always, LATOKEN team, thank you for making this possible. Wouldn't happen without y'all. But on that note, I would love to introduce our two great panelists we have for the episode today. So I would first like to introduce Keith. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Kent. Thanks very much. Great to be back here on VCTV. So I've been in venture capital for 20 years, and before that, I was an entrepreneur, mostly in the software and media space. I came into Mitsubishi Corporation to start up and run their Canadian venture capital activities 20 years ago. Then became president of BASF Venture Capital America, which is the world's largest chemical company, and then joined Pangea Ventures as general partner, raising Fund 3 and Fund 4. While I was at Pangea, I brought Adidas into the fund as an LP and worked very closely with them on sustainability and fashion. I worked with Fashion for Good, especially over the last year and a half. And I spoke at Davos earlier this year in January on sustainability and fashion, particularly on financing of sustainability and fashion. So it's an area that is quite a passion for me, and it is a little bit outside of, I think, what most of this panel was probably supposed to be focused on. But my particular passion is around sustainability in the fashion industry.
Perfect. We'll definitely cover sustainability on today's episode, but great to have you on the show, Keith. Our other panelists, we have Julio. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. I'm a managing partner of New York Bay Capital. We are a combination of advisory firm and venture capital fund. In other words, we invest in our own clients based in New York City. But we have presence around the world, and mostly in Latin America and Canada. In other words, Western Hemisphere type of approach. But we have clients all around the world and investment companies. I brought even a background of these are the four companies that where we have money or resources tied in right now. So I guess you could call it our portfolio of brand. And these are our entrepreneurs. So I'll talk to them, I'll talk about them as the discussion moves forward. But for now, suffice it to say that, as I said, New York Bay Capital is always interested in funding companies, and the idea of funding fashion is relatively new to us. I would say it's our newest vertical. Like many people, we started with tech and with other, high growth industries. But, fashion is a bit of a lonely space. There isn't that much competition when it comes to, funds competing for deals. Probably 90% of the venture capital funds out there don't even look at fashion as and yes, they look at retail. Yes, they might look at logistics, but they don't really look at designers and fashion brands, especially startup brands. Of course, when you're Adidas or when you're an established brand, you probably have, although you might have a hard time, a harder time than others, you'll get to capital. But when you're an entrepreneur starting in the fashion world, or when you already have a brand but it's small and you want it to get big, there aren't that many places to turn to, right? And that probably explains why this panel, there's two of us as opposed to 20 VC funds all looking at fashion. So if you're a fashion entrepreneur, or if you are looking to invest in fashion, we'd be happy to lend a hand and think about the new trends. And that's what the discussion today is going to be about. Thank you, of course, as usual, to LATOKEN for putting up VCTV, and for you, Kent, and very nice meeting you, Keith. And so let's discuss some trends.
Perfect. Thank you again, Julio. And we'll definitely jump into all those different parts and niches of the fashion industry. Again, my name is Kent Makashima, your host for today. Usually spend my time in the blockchain space, but occasionally do VC work, as today, talking to these lovely gentlemen. But, let's get this episode started. So just like Julio said, there's different parts of the fashion industry and, overall associated adjacent industry as well. Everything from luxury goods, as well as resale platforms recently, like Rebag, the Sierra Collective, have raised, capital in peak lockdown period, April and May, as well as, my colleagues at, Senrev, a purse company, recently raised late last year. So I'd like to first start, what general macro trends that we're seeing in the fashion and shopping industries as a whole? Keith, to you.
Well, I don't know that I can speak that knowledgeably to the trends in retail, but what I am following very actively is the trends in supply chain. There have been numerous issues that have caught the headlines for supply chain disruptions, slowdowns, bottlenecks, etc., throughout the supply chain that has affected almost every industry. In fashion, where you're dealing with multiple materials coming from multiple suppliers across many geographies, this has been a considerable issue, and numerous items simply cannot be made until their supply have been sorted out. There usually are second source suppliers, but oftentimes those second source suppliers are dependent upon the same primary raw material suppliers as the first choice supplier would be. So they are often affected by the same problems that are affecting the supplier of choice. So even though there has been some attempt to have some sort of compliance around multiple sources for inputs, ultimately, for some materials, there are just a limited number of raw material suppliers. They only come from certain geographies, and you've had great disruption there.
Mm-hmm. And then just a brief follow up to that. You talked about a lot of disruption, suppliers geographically. You have all these different stakeholders, very widely spread out. A lot of problems that can occur in the supply chain. Do you think there's a lot of strength moving forward now for omnichannel distribution methods, as well as the rise to direct-to-consumer type of companies?
Well, the direct-to-consumer type companies are still going to have the same problems. They still have to get their materials from somewhere, and I'm much more on that. My background is much more on that industrial side of things. The real supply chain, the materials themselves, whether they be biomaterials or whether they be synthetics, you have the same issues at the beginning of the supply chain, no matter what sort of distribution model you follow later on. I mean, perhaps Julio can speak to the end of the value chain more knowledgeably than I can. But it doesn't matter what sort of distribution model you choose, you're still going to have the same supply chain disruptions at this point, which is why I'm very interested in investing in supply chain innovation right now.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a key point that you made. A lot of people think that D2C is this magic silver bullet that solve logistics, consumers, but that's only at the very end of the supply chain, opposed to everything upstream, as you talked about, the sourcing, the manufacturing, etc. So let's go to you, Julio. Any of these macro trends, and if you would like to speak also more towards downstream to the retail side of the supply chain as well.
The trends right now, first there's an elephant in the room called the pandemic, right? And I can't think of any industry, well, maybe with the exception of the airline industry, but I can't think of any industry that has been really affected by the pandemic more than fashion. Clearly people are, want to wear new clothes to go out. They need to wear new clothes to go to the office, and these are trends that for now are on hold. No one's going to the office, so nobody needs a new suit or tie or business attire necessarily. And so the pandemic has kind of put a damper on things, but has forced many companies to rethink a little bit, how they go about the supply chain, and they realize that the fashion industry is very wasteful. There's waste everywhere, especially in the form of fabric that has been made and not used, or garments that have been manufactured, assembled, sewn in, but what aren't being sold. And so you've got the inventory problem, right? Or the markdown problem, which is that a designer or a brand may produce X many garments, but they already know most of them, or maybe some of them will not be sold for sure, right? It's an assumption already that's built in to fashion. Let's just send out there, and then whatever doesn't get sold, we'll have to mark down and maybe even eventually dispose of it. But it really is very wasteful. So, I think that the main trend, anything that tends to reduce the waste wherever it happens, is going to be a good investment. Or at least it's the place to be in fashion, because you're going to be allowing the industry to really grow and get out of some of its worst habits, which is, the overproduction and, over pollution. So, we're looking at things like on-demand manufacturing. I think that's a very nice trend. One of the companies I displayed, Katla, and it's easy to find. They have a wide variety of in fact, I have a background there about Katla. You'll see on Katla.com, they offer casual wear, so they're not trapped in the seasonal thing that fashion also suffers from, right? You have to have a spring collection, a fall collection, a winter collection, and as soon as when it's winter, you're already working on your spring collection and you're selling your summer collection, and all these collections are also extremely wasteful, especially when people are maybe not going out every day, right? So the trend to the casual wear, the lounge wear, comfortable clothes, where you don't have to have so many sizes and so much tailoring, is obviously a trend, and they're in that trend. But the most interesting thing I think about Katla is that if you order a garment, they will then manufacture it and send it to you. They do this not by themselves. They're really only a design company, but they have a JV with a manufacturer in the United States called On Point. And On Point Manufacturing literally has built themselves from the ground up recently as an on time, just in time, on demand manufacturer. You send them everything has to be very well planned though, and they do have to have the fabric, but they'll take the fabric that day and immediately sew up the sweatshirt or the skirt or the dress or the shirt or whatever it is. And because now people are not buying at retail anymore, but they're buying it from home, then they don't mind waiting 3 days, 4 days, 5 days for delivery. That's just normal. That you think the stuff is in inventory at Amazon, and then Amazon just sends it to you, and it has to take days, and it seems very reasonable for that. Gone are the days where people had to try on the clothes and they had to walk out of the Gap with their wearing or about to wear their garment for tomorrow or for that evening. So now that people are willing to wait, if you're really efficient on manufacturing, you can actually manufacture the garment in that period of time. It'll still take 3 days. Maybe you'll add one more day for the manufacturing time, but at the end of the day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, it's almost the same thing for a consumer. So that's why we really like Katla, because of the on-demand aspect. Everything they do is on demand, no inventory, and so at least you don't have the waste of having already used the fabric and having sewn it, and then have a whole bunch of sweatshirts or shirts in large when the demand was in petite, or so here you want a medium, you get a medium, and hopefully you won't return it, because returns is another problem of the fashion industry. I mean, I just feel bad for our fashion entrepreneurs, because they have it's I guess a really interesting industry, because you can be creative and you can kind of control your own destiny to some extent, but you're so beholden to all these forces. The consumer is fickle, your suppliers are difficult, your retailers are impossible, your retailers take not days, not weeks, but months to pay you. And so, we're trying our best. But I don't know if in this long exposition I was able to expose some of the trends. There are others, but I think it's the waste. The other trends, sustainability is important. Tracing things, inventory is important. And forging a link with your consumer, having a relationship, especially, it probably applies to everybody, but I think women designers, understand that there's a female customer at the end, and that you need to have a relationship, that the brand is something special, that people tend to sometimes be faithful to a brand and follow some brands and not others. So you have to also work a lot on your look, the way you present yourself, the way your brand behaves organically. It's another big challenge. So many industries don't have that problem.
Yeah, I agree. I think you hit a lot of key points there, and there's a lot of constraints in the fashion industry that pretty much have been ingrained in it for a long period of time. I think you hit it regarding inventory, releasing a collection. There's a fine line between mass producing because it brings down your bottom line, or that you have to dispose of certain goods to maintain scarcity, which is the MO of certain luxury companies like Burberry, where they burn excess supply. But you did point to something about sustainability. Is another thing that Keith brought up earlier, was that sustainability is very important in the fashion and retail industry moving forward. Keith, you expressed your interest about sustainability for you and your firm. Would you like to elaborate more on how we can move forward with increasing our sustainability?
Sure. As a lot of the work that I've done with Adidas over the years has been focused on complete recyclability of 100% of their products. And that's pretty difficult in shoes in particular. But we've been seeing some really interesting work. Now, theoretically, everything that goes in there is recyclable. And if you had a pure product, then it's relatively cheap to do that too. The problem is that nothing after use is really pure, especially a shoe. Not only is it made of mixed materials where you have different synthetic molecules making up the different layers in a shoe, and you have cloth for stitching or for upper layers or on the interior, and a number of different fibers, as well as you have colorants and UV protectants and sealants, and there's a lot of things that go in there. So you can't just throw a shoe into the recycling. How can you take it apart cheaply? How can you make this maybe designed from the very beginning that it can be taken apart at end of life cheaply? One of the most exciting approaches that I've seen, which is from a startup, and it is pre-commercial, but very, very exciting work there. And I'm not going to name the startup, I'm sorry. But I have seen work that has a solvent which can separate out the PET, that's the plastic mostly used for the synthetic fibers going into a shoe, and get a virgin precursor chemical for what can then be used for making a virgin PET, chemically identical, not just a similar molecule, but the exact same molecule. But this same process also drops out all of the organic fibers, the cotton. So you can drop in these dirty mixed materials item and end up getting nice pure chemical precursors coming out one end, and a bundle of fibers coming out the other, which then can be fed into typical recycled fiber processes. So that kind of approach that simplifies things and doesn't require mechanical sorting, which is really expensive, difficult to maintain, and you just get dirt and contaminants coming through, which will mess up all your chemistry further down the line. Approaches like this, which are more pure chemical, just let it cook and then take out your different streams afterward. That's the kind of approach that I very much favor. The challenge with that, well, though it works, now it has to be proven that it scales. And any chemical engineer will tell you that just because you can do things in a shaker flask does not mean that you can do things in a 20,000 liter vessel. And ultimately, for the scale that we need to go to here for the consumption of fashion worldwide, we need to get to an enormous scale. So that's the challenge ahead of this group right now, but really promising work going on there.
Well, that sounds like a very incredible technology, but go ahead, Julio.
Oh, well, sorry. I already named it, and I can name the company. It's almost in the phrases that Keith used. He said to simplify, and this is one of our favorite companies, Simply Fiber. And you know, their goal is basically to eliminate this problem, which is people sewing, right? The fiber that they're working on, and of course it has to be scaled. It hasn't been shown to scale yet, so it's still a startup. But you know, we typically rely on cotton for all of our fibers, or most of them. Most of the world is now wearing cotton, and cotton, you know, needs to be planted. It needs to be done in a certain way. Simply Fiber is working on making fibers not out of particularly cotton, but about any plant. I mean, they literally could take grass. Anything that has cellulose in it can be worked in such a way as to make flat, you know, or almost flat. You could call it fabric, right? It's a flat mesh, and the process reminds me a lot of fiberglass, where you can take plant fibers and align them in such a way that you actually can create a good mesh that will be resistant and therefore wearable, but at the same time flexible. Now, the process of manufacturing, though, is very different, because you're not going to be making rolls and rolls and rolls of fabric like cotton, which then needs to be sewn together to create a garment, which is why I showed all of those people sewing in front of sewing machines. This is really more of a baking or a molding of the wet fiber, when you know it comes out wet, but it'll then become solid, and you can make a mold that will make, let's say, the front of a t-shirt in one manufacturing step. And then you can create the back of the t-shirt, and then you can glue both of them together and create a t-shirt with a front and a back. right? Where you really have two different pieces, where there was no thread required, there's no stitching or no sewing, because what you have is a kind of a heat-induced system of making things stick to each other. And then at the end of the day, if all works well and you wear this, it's 100% recyclable, because it's just grass, it's just cellulose. Yes, there's some chemicals that need to be put in there, and there's a whole process, and they're working. This is a company that's working out of Illinois, and on the border of Illinois and Indiana, making this. But I've seen, great samples that they've produced. So you'll have the front of the pants, the back of the pants, the front of the shirt, the back of the shirt, and a lot more research has to be done. But at least here you can migrate away from a specific fabric and still have a really interesting garment that eventually becomes 100% recyclable, and where you've made it by eliminating the entire middle step of having to have thread and sewing.
Mhm. I think it's
it's new tech, right? Maybe it'll work. Maybe it'll be available in a store near you in 5 years.
Yeah, I think that you both interestingly pointed out like two different types of sustainability tactics that we can. Julio, you said about very upstream, adjusting like the manufacturing to create like more sustainable products that can be recycled down the road. Keith, you brought up more we have these solutions downstream that can take existing products, break it down potentially into fully recyclable and more green methods. I'd like to further go into that with you, Keith, about how you think that do we need to come up with more methods downstream to address previously made products, or do we need to focus upstream about how do we create these products so it makes it easier for the sustainability and the recycling later down the road?
Well, I don't think there's any question that we need to do both. It doesn't matter how great our recycling techniques are. There are still going to be companies, people, and places in the world that continue to do things the way that they always have. And we have to deal with that supply, that dominant source of supply for now, and over the next century, that will shift towards newer ways of doing things. But we are talking timescales like that. It's going to be decades for new techniques to become dominant in fashion manufacturing. That means we have to find ways to address the old ways of doing things unless we want the unsustainable garbage to be piling up. And working with Adidas on this, I came to understand that for them it was it affected them on many levels. There's the sustainability angle. They want to be a sustainable company. There is there's a reputation around that, but very directly to speaking to brand, almost all of the products with their 3 stripes that they've ever produced lie in landfills around the world, and that for them is just like a dagger to the heart of their brand, and they do not want that at all. They have already introduced 100% recycled shoes. Now they cannot sell those at a profit, not yet. They've introduced shoes that are made entirely from recovered plastic from the ocean. Actually, really cool looking shoe. I thought it was great. And it's not just the shoes, of course. There's all the other products that they offer, but shoes are at the heart of their brand. That's what they started off when Adi Dassler was working in his parents' house as a teenager making shoes. That's how it all got started. Shoes actually sort of boil down all of the problems that we have in this issue in one very complicated package. So for me, I think increasingly we're seeing that be an issue. Nike is another one, also obviously big competitor to Adidas, investing in sustainable materials. So they're making their shoes out of very sustainable materials. There's a really interesting company out of San Francisco called MycoWorks, and they are making a leather equivalent. I mean, this stuff, like I've handled it. I've been there. It feels like, smells like, it has greater tensile strength than leather, but it's grown from mushrooms. And you don't have the cruelty aspects associated with it. There's an opportunity here for not only a better product that can be made cheaply, very sustainably. End of life, the stuff will break down just like mushrooms do, but it will last as long as you need it to for whatever your application is, whether it be shoes or a leather jacket, or you want to upholster your car or living room, whatever. It will do all of that. I find that kind of innovation really compelling for moving us as a species and as a planet towards a more sustainable and cruelty-free world. But also the end-of-life issues are sort of built in when you're using materials from that. They're just going to break down like other vegetative matter.
I think that's very important, is that especially that when you target like that end of life of the product, it's either you have a product that can easily break down organically in the environment, or you have to create that connection with the consumer so that it is recycled properly after the product is made. And that's to kind of return to a point that you made earlier, Julio, about how in the retail you need to connect with, you have to connect with the end consumer, whether it's knowing who your person is, or you have to know, what are their current like habits, how are they using your product, etc. You have any, additional insight on that retail to or brand to consumer relationship?
Well, we really like a company in Mexico. It's called Colectiva. They're addressing a different issue. They make luxury garments, handmade, almost like the Brioni of Mexico, but for women. I guess Brioni is famous for suits, but for other things. But let me see. Colectiva is they're about helping indigenous communities, right? Like Mexico has a tradition of very fine garment making by hand. That is done by women from certain villages that have that learned their craft from their mothers and their mothers' mothers, and they use handmade looms to make fabrics, usually from cotton. So this company is trying to convince its customers, and it's doing a very good job because it sells at Bergdorf's and high-end luxury places like that. You look it up. These pictures don't necessarily do it justice, but a handmade garment, but where the company certifies that this is not about labor exploitation, right? Because the fashion industry also has the bad rap of using child labor in Asia or generally exploiting its most vulnerable part of the supply chain, which is sometimes the people who work in the garment industry from a manufacturing perspective. So they work together with NGOs that finance the local production. They keep track of every step. So almost as in blockchain fashion, they'll tell you, each dress you buy, each blouse, who made it, where it was made, in what town, in what dates, when it was manufactured. They have all of this information, and they're actually going to be starting. They're going to be selling the clothes with a VR code or a QR code, where the user can actually scan information about her garment on her phone. Right. That's something that is already ready for next year's shipments. And so the tracing is going to help the industry, clean up its act when it comes to accusations of exploitation of labor. And it's not a step forward in efficiency, because anything that is handmade and that is sort of unique and is tracked individually is clearly not made for the mass market. But it will at least help in other aspects that the industry, which the industry suffers from, which is this sort of reputational, question as to, who made it and who really got the value for it and who's really benefiting. And, is this an exploitative type of a relationship, right? And Colectiva is working really, really hard to reverse that. But Keith, did you raise your hand there? Because I'm done. I don't know if you wanted to say something.
Sure. Traceability is also something I think is really interesting from an ESG perspective. At Pangea, we made an investment in an American company called TrueTag. Actually, the tech is out of Hawaii. This is a really fascinating and different way to do tracing. They make these, each batch is completely unique. Nanomaterials are actually edible, so they can go into food, they can really go into anything. But what's really cool about this, although for really advanced functionality, you need a very special optical reader for that. But for a lot of functionality, all you got to do is point your phone camera at the product itself, not the label. The product itself has these edible nanomaterial or micro materials in whatever it is, in the fabric, it can be in food, it can be anything. Of course, it can go on a label, but right now we have inks and whatnot to go on labels. But in the product itself, this becomes a really interesting thing where a consumer can then, just with a free app, point their camera at it and scan it, and those optical resonances are picked up by the camera, by the software, and you instantly get this check. It reaches out to the internet with that signature, and it comes back and says, oh yeah, this is legit, this is unique, or no, this is not authentic, or this is from a recalled batch. Here's a URL for a form to get it replaced, or whatever it is. It will all come out through that. I love that. Again, it's this simplicity of it. From the consumer perspective, it's just kind of cool. People enjoy pointing their cameras at QR codes. Well, in this case, the product itself becomes a QR code. The QR code is invisible. It is everywhere on the product. And that is nigh on impossible to fake, especially since every batch is a completely unique optical signature on these particles. So I love products like that. Again, the sort of supply chain theme is something that I'm very focused on as I'm with my new fund. I'm very, very interested in the opportunities there.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. Track and trace, a lot of people, think about, oh, it's a way for me just to figure out if a product is legitimate or not. But there are a lot of other applications that you did hinted at, for the point of like recalls, being able to track like bad batches from, the upstream perspective, much faster for them to, identify, oh, these batches are problematic. We might have to reach out to, these retail parties, these consumers, to like, hey, don't consume this lettuce as E. coli or something like that. And I think that's where the power of, provenance and that data tracking is much more to explore, as we move forward and innovate in that sense. But unfortunately, we're running to a close on today's episode. As much as I love to dive into supply chain, since I've been working in that field for such a long time now. But I'd like to get, the best way for people to reach out to you, learn more about your fund, and other interesting things they would like to discuss. Keith, what's the best way for our audience to reach out to you?
Sure. Follow me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. I'm at Keith A. Gillard. My new fund is something that we're still keeping under wraps. It's sort of a hybrid PE VC model. I'll talk about it in a future episode, but we're making our first acquisition right now. Yeah, we do have a kind of supply chain focus. I'll hint that much. Yeah, we'll stay tuned for that. I'm not revealing the name of it yet because it's just a stealth website right now.
Perfect. That's sometimes the best websites, but awesome. Thank you, Keith, very much. Happy to have you on the show today. I'm looking forward to seeing you on future episodes. And then Julio, best way for our audience to reach out to you, discuss, chat, potential investments.
Well, I like email, so my email is Julio, Julio, at New York Bay Capital, which is just that in the screen, nybaycapital.com altogether. That's one way. You can also spell out newyorkbaycapital.com. I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm a member of the Harvard Business School Angels. I'm a member of the MIT Angels of New York, and our fund is a small fund. It's called New York Bay Blue, but it always has a little bit of money for startups, so that people can feel like we'll help them not only with some advice and some introductions and some capital raising, but we always put our money where our mouth is. So we will, gladly, invest some money to companies, as long as they really seem to be doing something innovative. Me Too is not for us, but if it sounds innovative, and even if it's a little crazy, we get excited about that, and we can have some friends who will also help.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you, Julio. Thank you for having you on the show, as always. If you like today's episode, make sure to drop a like and subscribe below. Otherwise, tune into future episodes of VCTV, where you'll see great people like Julio and Keith will probably be returning to future episodes. This is VCTV, and thank you for